And thank you, Bela, for taking part in this, and thank you all for coming. I should apologise, I suppose, for delivering this lecture in English. I was taught French at school as if it were a dead language. Deliberate policy, I believe, at that time in England, that we were taught to read but barely to speak it. So I am crippled by that odd feature of the English education system. Or you might say a feature of the education system that anticipated the world that was to come. In his 8th letter from the mountain, written in 1764 in defence of the social contract in Emile against attacks made on them in Geneva, Rousseau declared, "Up to the present, the democratic constitution has been poorly examined. All those who have spoken about it either did not know it, or took too little interest in it, or had an interest in presenting it in a false light. None of them has sufficiently distinguished the sovereign from the government." What he meant by this, he made clear both in the social contract and elsewhere in the letters from the mountain, was that the ancient democracies, in which the citizens gathered in an assembly on a regular basis to administer their societies and make judgments of policy about all matters of concern to them, which of course is also, as you know, a Swiss model, or model of parts of some Swiss communes, was not an appropriate model for the kind of democracy which he advocated. They had not distinguished between government and sovereignty, and had treated both day-to-day policy questions and fundamental decisions about the organisation of their societies as falling within the scope of the democratic assembly. Against this view, Rousseau insisted that his democracy would be restricted to acts of sovereignty, acts affecting the fundamental legal structure, and the government, including even such things as decisions on going to war, would not ideally be democratic in character. His own preference, as you know, was for aristocracy. In the 9th letter, he also made clear, much clearer in fact than he had done in the social contract itself, that a distinction of this kind permitted the reappearance of democracy in the modern world, a world in which citizens simply could not give the time and attention to government which had been possible for their ancient predecessors. Even in a city the size of Geneva, he wrote, ancient politics could not be revived. Ancient peoples, he said, are no longer a model for modern ones. They are too alien to them in every respect. You are neither Romans nor Spartans. You are not even Athenians. Leave aside these great names that do not suit you. You are merchants, artisans, bourgeois, always occupied with their private interests, with their work, with their trafficking, with their gain. People for whom even liberty is only a means for acquiring without obstacle and for possessing in safety. This situation demands maxims particular to you. Not being idle, as ancient peoples were, you cannot ceaselessly occupy yourselves with the government, as they did. In the letters, he was chiefly concerned with the inapplicability of ancient democratic government even to a small city such as Geneva, since modern commercial conditions meant that citizens, even if they could meet in an assembly, couldn't do so in the near continuous session which ancient politics demanded. But in his considerations on the government of Poland, in 1772, he used the same distinction between sovereign and government to recommend a constitutional restructuring for a large modern state in which it was physically impossible for the citizens to meet together. It's clear that in his eyes the distinction was absolutely essential if democratic politics were to be reintroduced to a world of large commercial states. Two innovations were needed before a theory of this kind, this split between a fundamental level of sovereign legislation and governmental level. Two innovations were needed before a theory of this kind could be put forward. A theory which, as we shall see later, corresponds to what has become the default constitutional structure of most modern states, in which a procedure such as a plebiscite is used to ratify fundamental constitutional legislation, while an elected assembly or set of assemblies legislate on less fundamental matters. Both innovations are to be found in Rousseau. He's not necessarily himself the innovator, but both features are to be found in Rousseau. One was the idea that sovereignty and government can be distinguished, and that different kinds of legislation are appropriate to the different levels. And this idea is, of course, going to be the principal subject of this lecture. The other is less obvious, but it warrants a brief discussion before I turn to the main issue. It was that it's possible, or even desirable, to restrict democratic action to a final judgment about what should be binding on the society, and to exclude from democracy to a great extent the process of collective deliberation. That exclusion seems surprising to many modern theorists of democracy, for whom, following an idealized and in many ways unhistorical picture of an ancient assembly, the activity of citizens conferring and arguing about their collective decisions is central to the nature of democratic politics. But part of Rousseau's claim that modern states can be democratic was that the principal act of the democratic citizen is the vote and not the discussion. Indeed, he strikingly remarked to the social contract that the ideal democratic moment would be if, when the people being furnished with adequate information held its deliberations, the citizens had no communication one with another. And he went on to say that it was precisely the activity of communicating one with another which gave rise to what he called partial associations and the eventual corruption of the state. Like much in Rousseau, as we shall see in a moment, this looked back to Hobbes, who had famously denounced deliberative assemblies, but was willing to concede that non-deliberative democracy could be a reasonable means of organising a state. The relevance of the attack on deliberation as the prime democratic activity was that the objection to ancient democracy in a modern state had always been presented before Rousseau as largely, so to speak, logistical, in that the citizens of a modern state couldn't physically gather together or couldn't find the time to do so. Implicit in this as an objection was, however, the belief that the gathering would be to discuss legislation and that there couldn't be legislation without deliberation. This was why the election of representatives, which had after all been part of the basic structure of government in most Western states for 500 years or more, was not normally seen as the act of a democracy, for the deliberative and legislative activity of the society was restricted to those representatives. Once it was recognised the element of discussion in their activity could be slight or even non-existent, and once it was recognised that the important acts of democratic sovereignty were by their very nature infrequent, the way was open to recreate democracy in a modern setting and get the citizens as a whole to legislate as well as to elect. I should also emphasise at this point that we are talking quite concretely about legislation and not about a vague idea, which of course goes back hundreds of years, that the people create in some undefined fashion like custom or convention the terms of their collective life. From antiquity down to the 18th century, all societies had characteristically possessed sites of legislative authority, which dealt indifferently with matters of general constitutional significance and matters of limited or local importance. The United Kingdom is still a fine example of such an arrangement. It still possesses a site of this ancient kind, for there is no institutional or structural difference between Acts of Parliament, which undeniably have a fundamental or constitutional character, such as the Act of Settlement, which determined the descent of the Crown, the Act of Union, which united England and Scotland and may shortly be repealed, the Parliament Act, which took away the powers of the House of Lords, or the European Communities Act, which involved the accession of Britain to the EU, or the Common Market as it was then. There's no difference between these Acts of Parliament and, let us say, an act prescribing the organisation of the London police force. These are acts passed in exactly the same way, and there is no formal distinction between the two. There's been some argument recently about ways you might introduce a formal distinction. I could talk about that perhaps in questions, but the standard view, the authoritative view, is, as it always has been, there's no difference between an act which raises money for sewers somewhere and the most important constitutional act you can imagine. In this respect, as one might expect on other grounds, the United Kingdom remains pre-modern in its political structures, if modernity is marked, as I think it is, by precisely the kind of theorising I'm talking about. It can be contrasted, the United Kingdom can be contrasted with societies in which there is an institutional division between constitutional and other kinds of legislation, and in which, as a consequence, it's possible to talk about society as possessing a written constitution in the sense of a segregated set of laws generated in some distinctive fashion, as in the United States. As has often been observed, most recently by a man called John Gardner in a very interesting essay, the United Kingdom does have a written constitution, although people often say it doesn't. It does have a written constitution, as much as anywhere does. The foundational acts I just mentioned are, after all, written. They are acts of Parliament with words. And the fact that there is a great deal unwritten, which is part of constitutional practice, would not distinguish the UK from the US or any other country with a written constitution. There's a great deal, one tends to forget, there's a great deal in the United States which is constitutional practice, which is not anything to do with the Constitution. I mean, my favourite example, although people don't think about it very much, is there is nothing in the Constitution, so nothing in the federal Constitution, and there's not much, even in the state Constitution, to stop the same man or woman being governor of every single state in the Union, which is an interesting case you think about. Because if there were such a person, he would have more power than the president. And it's also the case, for those of you who know anything about the history of the Netherlands, that was precisely the role of the stadtholder in the United Provinces. He just happened to be governor or stadtholder of each province, except one. So, there's plenty of unwritten stuff in the US. What the United Kingdom doesn't have is a separate legislature for specifically constitutional measures. And in this respect, as I said, is the same as all political associations used to be until the 18th century. It's a familiar piece of history that written constitutions didn't appear until the 1770s, when the newly independent states of North America began to draft them, followed by the current US Constitution, the French constitutions of the 1790s, and all the modern constitutional documents thereafter. And we tend to think that what was new was the idea of writing it down. But once we approach the question from the direction with which I'm concerned today, we can see that what was really new was not the idea of writing fundamental laws, but of handing the authority to write the laws to an institution which might put in only fleeting appearances and be largely forgotten during the actual political activity of a community. I expect, for example, that there will be no new amendment to the US Constitution in my lifetime, unless Larry Lessig can miraculously succeed in his campaign to use the amending procedure to overturn the Citizens United judgment. Put in this way, that the sovereign legislator has an institutional shape, but is usually dormant. We can see the oddity of the idea, and why it proved so hard to imagine prior to the 18th century, and prior to a proper understanding of the distinction whose history I'm going to trace. Its oddity is also, I think, an explanation of why it continues to be something that is so hard to theorise, and why we constantly slip back into assimilating sovereignty and government, and treating the people as something which can only be represented by the institutions which act as their government, and not as a real legislating sovereign. While in the letters Rousseau claimed that no one had used the distinction between the two things in order to interpret democratic constitutions, and while in the social contract he warned that his long discussion of the distinction in Book 3 requires careful reading, with the implication that it was unfamiliar and difficult to follow, he must in fact have been very well aware that he was not the first person to make this distinction, and furthermore that he was not even the first person to apply it to the question of democracy. But as we shall see in a moment, for more or less a century, the distinction had been either disregarded or expressly repudiated by the principal European political theorists, so that it was not unreasonable for Rousseau to present his own extensive use of it as an innovation. The first person to insist on the importance of a distinction of this kind between the sovereign and the government, as his contemporaries and successors well understood, had in fact been the French theorist Jean Baudin, writing in the 1560s and 1570s. It is a central feature of his theory of sovereignty, something which should have puzzled Baudin's modern readers more than it generally has done. For as Rousseau's use of the distinction later illustrates, it seems to fit more naturally into a defence of modern democratic politics than into the kind of absolutist theory commonly ascribed to Baudin. But while Baudin's principal objective in formulating the distinction was, of course, not to defend democratic politics of a Rousseauian kind, he was actually more sympathetic to democracy than one might have expected. The distinction made its first appearance in Chapter 6 of his Method for the Easy Understanding of Histories. Very useful, interesting, appealing title. Sorry. In 1566. In the context of a thoroughgoing attack on the applicability of Aristotle's political ideas to a modern state. He developed his ideas more fully, but along the same lines, in his famous Republic 10 years later. Baudin objected that Aristotle had assumed that governmental power, such things as deliberating about peace and war, making final judgments in legal cases, and certain kinds of legislation, were the marks of kurion, or supreme power, and where they were lodged, sovereignty was to be found. And possibly, as a consequence, sovereignty could be divided between different governmental institutions. So, you'll have a court, you'll have some deliberative body, etc., etc. But these powers, Baudin observed, in most modern European states were no longer in practice under the control of the notional sovereigns of those states, the kings. Judges made final decisions in legal cases, and although in theory in some states, or some nations, you could appeal to the king, in many you couldn't. I mean, for example, the judgments of the Parliament of Paris were final. Deliberation in most modern European states was in the hands of bodies where the king never turned up, as in England. I mean, turned up once during the parliamentary opening, and that had been true for hundreds of years. The same was true, of course, of the Parlement, the law courts in France, and the Estates General in France. Instead, Baudin insisted, we should distinguish between what he called administratio, or gouvernement, the exercise of power, and majestas, or souveraineté, the legitimacy possessed by a fundamental source of law in society. I should stress once again the role, or rather the absence of a role, for deliberation in Baudin's theory. It was in large part because the key deliberations could be conducted in settings well away from the exercise of sovereign power that the distinction between sovereign and government could be made. In the case of France, his primary concern, of course, Baudin thought that this foundational legitimacy, giving validity to all measures done in his name, was possessed by the king. And any move to claim it by the deliberative assemblies would be usurpation and a mistake based on Aristotle's misleading arguments. But what struck Baudin's contemporaries most was not in fact his account of the French monarchy, but the examples he culled from Roman history. In Baudin's time, it was customary to believe, for example, that the dictator was a kind of monarch, possessing full sovereign power during his term in office, despite the fact that he'd been elected by the people. This was because there was no appeal from any of his decisions, so the actual power in the Republic was clearly in his hands. And on general Aristotelian grounds, he counted as a monarch, albeit a temporary one. And there are plenty of Renaissance writers who say this about the dictator. They say dictatorship is one of the various forms of monarchy that we encounter in the world. But Baudin had none of this, saying that it can happen that one or more people have absolute power given to them for some certain period of time, upon the expiration of which they are no more than private subjects. And even while they are in power, they cannot call themselves sovereign princes. They are but trustees and custodians of that power, until such time as it pleases the people or the prince to take it back, for the latter always remain in lawful possession. And he insisted, partly working out the logic of this position, that Republican Rome had been a democracy and not, as had always been thought before him, a mixed state, down at least to the time of Vespasian. About a century after, it was normally supposed to have come to an end with the Principate of Augustus. And he was completely uninterested in the fact that the Comitia never met after, or barely met after the time of Augustus. He simply insisted that, at least theoretically, sovereign power in Rome remained in the hands of the people, at least until Vespasian. I mean, it's a view that quite a lot of modern historians of Rome have some sympathy with, actually. Fergus Millen, for example, would agree with that. The famous Baudinian concept of sovereignty, we might say with only slight exaggeration, was always much more hospitable in practice to democracy than to any other of the traditional forms of government. And the subsequent history of democracy emphasizes how important its links to this theory of sovereignty was. The hospitality of this theory pleased many of his early readers. Quite radical figures, including the early Congregationalists of New England, used the sovereign government distinction to explain how their societies, in the case of the Congregationalists, their churches, were in fact democracies, despite the fact that most executive decisions were made by small boards or even single people. But it also alarmed many other people, because they saw the implications of this was that many states which looked like monarchies could in fact be redescribed as democracies with a great deal of political implications there. And the predominant response to Baudin among the more respectable writers in the early 17th century was represented by the enormously influential writings of Hugo Grotius, and particularly his De Jure Belliae Parcis of 1625. Grotius had always despised Baudin. He described him once as someone who knew a great deal but was very confused. His book De Republica was a great heap of a work, full of falsities. He has lots of other insults in other places. And in his De Jure Belli, he accordingly reasserted, Grotius accordingly reasserted, something explicitly like Aristotle's account of politics, repeating Aristotle's analysis of what the various functions involved in governing a state were, without any attempt to distinguish between, for example, legislation and consultation, except that some acts of the supreme power were to do with public things such as legislation, and some with private, such as judicial decisions. As for Baudin's prime example of the distinction between sovereign and government, the Roman dictatorship, Grotius was blunt. We must distinguish between the thing itself and the manner of enjoying it. Thus, among the Romans, the dictator was sovereign, summum imperium habebat, for a time. Neither can I agree with those who say the Roman dictator had not the sovereign power because it was not perpetual. For the nature of moral things is known by their operations, wherefore those powers which have the same effects should be called by the same name. Now the dictator, during the whole time of his office, exercised all the acts of civil government with as much authority as the most absolute king, and nothing he had done could be annulled by any other power. This claim that we shouldn't distinguish between the sovereign and the government, but should treat the day-to-day site of governmental decision as the seat of sovereignty, became, as I said, the standard view throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. It was adopted, for example, by the most fashionable theorist of the latter part of the 17th century, Samuel Pufendorf, who described the distinction between sovereign and government as a subtlety worth only to be disputed in the schools, and again insisted that the key question was where actual power lay in any state. It was ridiculous to say that Rome under Vespasian was a democracy, in effect. That's a clear example. That's just crazy. It's a subtlety. On this view, a people were sovereign in the sense that they were an autonomous entity, a political entity, whose identity was given by some common commitment to live together. But they were not necessarily sovereign in the sense that they constituted a fundamental democratic legislature. Sovereignty, for writers like Grotius and Pufendorf, was essentially the notion current still in international relations, where a sovereign nation doesn't mean a democratic nation. Unexpectedly, it was Thomas Hobbes who came to Baudin's defense against these strictures of Grotius, and indeed pushed Baudin's basic idea even further than Baudin himself had done. He set out his case against Grotius's account of sovereignty most clearly in chapter 7 of his De Cive of 1642. The work of Hobbes, which we should always remember, was read on the continent, both in its Latin form and even more in a French translation, which Hobbes himself authorized. Leviathan, by contrast, was not translated completely, fully, into French until 1972, which is, of course, an amazing fact, well worth remembering, that when virtually everyone on the continent writes about Hobbes down to the last 40 years or so, they primarily have in mind Hobbes's De Cive du Citoyen in the Sorbonne translation. And it is I think it's a remarkable book, really interesting. Chapter 7 begins with a resounding claim of great importance to the history of democratic ideas. When men have met to erect a commonwealth, they are, almost by the very fact that they have met, a democracy. From the fact that they have gathered voluntarily, they are understood to be bound by the decisions made by agreement of the majority. And that is a democracy as long as the convention lasts, the meeting lasts, or is set to reconvene at certain times and places. For a convention whose will is the will of all the citizens has sovereign power. And because it is assumed that each man in this convention has the right to vote, it follows that it is a democracy. So it's a very clear statement that almost everyone forgets. Hobbes says that when men create civil society, a commonwealth, that is necessarily a democracy, initially. This initial democratic sovereign constituted the people, Hobbes thought. It had no identity other than the set of individuals agreeing that their common affairs should be bound by majority voting. The deliberate contrast with Grotius is clear, and Hobbes pursued his criticisms of Grotius into his account of the distinction between sovereignty and government, revealing in the process that he was very far from being a theorist of power, as it is usually understood. A sovereign democracy, possessing summum imperium, he argued, was compatible with various kinds of time-limited monarchical administrationes or governments. And he explained this using the vivid analogy which gives my lecture this afternoon its title, The Sleeping Sovereign. He presumed, of course, in these discussions, that a democracy must involve an actual assembly of citizens. If a king, and I'll read you the whole long passage, very interesting. If a king without an heir is about to go to sleep and not wake up again, i.e. is about to die, and hands sovereign power to someone to exercise until he awakes, he is handing him also the succession. Likewise, if a people, in choosing a temporary monarch, at the same time abolishes its own power of reconvening, it is passing dominion over the Commonwealth to him. Next, a king who is going to sleep for a while gives sovereign power to someone else to exercise, administrandum, and takes it back when he wakes up. Just so a people, on the election of a temporary monarch, retains the right of meeting again at a certain time and place, and on that day resumes its power, and in the whole intervening period, sovereign power, like ownership, remained with the people. A king who has given his power to someone else to exercise while he himself stays awake can resume it again when he wishes. Just so a people which duly meets throughout the term set for a time-limited monarch can strip him of power if it so wishes, as dictators were appointed among the Romans. Finally, a king who gives the exercise of his power to another person while he sleeps and can wake up again only with the consent of that person has lost his life and his power together. Just so a people which has committed power to a time-limited monarch on the terms that it cannot meet again without his command is radically dissolved, and its power rests with the person it has elected. Hobbes thus restated the Bodinian distinction between sovereign and government, using the same terminology of summum imperium or summum potestas, contrasted with administratio. But he was willing to go much further and spell out, as Baudin himself notably had been unwilling to do, that not merely a dictator, but kings elected for life were not true monarchs, because it makes that clear. If the people remain with power, because they remain in being, and the fact that they've allowed someone to exercise their power during the life of that person is like a king going to sleep and saying, while I'm asleep, saying to the vizier, you can exercise power until I wake up or until you die, and when you die I have to wake up and do something. Right? And that is essentially the position of a king elected for life. And since in Hobbes's day there were technically only two hereditary monarchies in Europe, again we tend to forget that is to say France and England, technically hereditary, of course most of them were hereditary, but France and England were the only two monarchies, I think, where at least the theory of monarchical succession was entirely one of heredity, otherwise it's always at least notionally election of some sort. This was a very startling claim. It occasioned some of the sharpest criticism which Samuel Pufendorf delivered to Hobbes, when he said that we utterly dislike the assertion of Mr. Hobbes, which we meet with in his book De Cive. This notion, if taken in the gross sense in which it is delivered, we cannot but look upon as highly dangerous and prejudicial to all those limited princes who are ordained by the voluntary donation of the people and bound up to certain fundamental laws. This is the essence of his hostility to Hobbes in this area, and to Baudin, whose views on the dictator he also attacked. In 17th century Europe, there were likely to be few people, even any longer in France, who wanted to argue for a sleeping constitutional sovereign in a modern state in the form of a king. The force of the idea, for obvious reasons, was always going to be, as it had really been even in Baudin, that a people could be thought of as a sleeping sovereign. It was this possibility which Grotius and Pufendorf feared, and which Hobbes, remarkable as it might seem on the conventional account of his work, was willing to countenance. It's worth considering the very far-reaching implications of these ideas. On Hobbes's account, a sovereign can be very thoroughly asleep. In the case of an elected monarchy, it might in principle be asleep for 60 or 70 years, or even more. Moreover, when awake, the sovereign might do nothing more than select a new monarch and promptly fall asleep again. So all actual legislation to do with the ordinary lives of the citizens, and all actual power exercised over them, would be in the hands of the monarch, yet the monarch would not be the sovereign. At the very least, this calls into question what is commonly held a naively Austinian view of Hobbes's theory of sovereignty. For Hobbes's theory is very clearly not a theory of habitual obedience to a site of power in the sense of physical strength, control of an army, for example. This point was made by Hobbes himself very clearly in chapter 10 of De Cive, writing about an infant monarch. The advantages and disadvantages of a regime do not depend upon him in whom the authority of the Commonwealth resides, but upon the ministers of the sovereignty, ministres imperii. Hence it is no obstacle to the good government of a Commonwealth if the monarch is a woman, a boy, or an infant, provided that the holders of the ministries and public offices are competent to handle the business. And he expressed the idea in dramatic fashion in Leviathan, when he asserted in a passage which has often surprised his readers that if a monarch subdued by war render himself subject to the victor, his subjects are delivered from their former obligation and become obliged to the victor. But if he be held prisoner, or have not the liberty of his own body, he is not understood to have given away the right of sovereignty, and therefore his subjects are obliged to yield obedience to the magistrates formerly placed, governing not in their own name, but in his. For his right remaining, the question is only of the administration, that is to say, of the magistrates and officers, which, if he have not means to name, he is supposed to approve those which he himself had formerly appointed. This was an important practical issue when Hobbes was writing, for the king was, or had recently been, in prison. When Hobbes began writing Leviathan, we think, before the execution, the king was in prison after, of course, he was dead. But royal governors were still in office in many places of great strategic significance for the royalists, including the Channel Islands, Virginia, and above all, Ireland. Parliament really feared that the royal government in Ireland would recruit an army and regain power using Irish troops. It's the nightmare scenario which led, of course, to Cromwell's countervailing attack on Ireland. And on Hobbes's account, it was entirely reasonable to suppose that the imprisoned king was still sovereign, as he remained sovereign until his death, even if he could do nothing, just as he would if he were similarly inert while he was asleep. You can't do anything while you're asleep, but you're still the king. Hobbes provides an even more dramatic example in chapter 12 of De Cive. When right and exercise, jus and exercitio, are separated, the government of the Commonwealth is like the ordinary government of the world, in which God, the first mover of all things, produces natural effects through the order of secondary causes. But when he who has the right to reign wishes to participate himself in all judgments, consultations, and public actions, it is a way of running things comparable to God's attending directly to everything himself, contrary to the order of nature. So God, too, according to Hobbes, is a sleeping soul. It was Grotius and Pufendorf. Sorry. It was Grotius and Pufendorf whom Rousseau excoriated in both the Second Discourse and the Social Contract. And his insistence that the sovereignty government distinction had been ignored and that it was critical to modern democracy was above all a response to their writings. Hobbes's view, on the other hand, at least as set out in De Cive, was much closer to Rousseau's own. That's true, I think, across the board. I mean, there's something I'm working on at the moment. But certainly in this area, the two are very close. This was so not least, as I suggested at the beginning of this paper, because both Hobbes and Rousseau were hostile to democratic government, in the sense of the ancient civic assemblies dominated by orators. Athens was in fact not a democracy, but a very tyrannical aristocracy, governed by philosophers and orators, said Rousseau in his Political Economy, in words that could have, and probably did, come straight out of Hobbes. As he made clear in his Letters from the Mountain, as I was saying at the beginning, Rousseauvian democracy was not an idyll of an ancient city-state transported to the present day, but a serious attempt at working out how a modern commercial state might genuinely deserve the title of democracy. Republic is the term he often uses, but he does use the term democracy as well. And the key to this was the separation of government from fundamental acts of sovereign power, and the full participation of the citizens in those fundamental acts. Government, on the other hand, Rousseau always said, should not take the form of a democracy. And as Richard Watmore has recently shown, he puzzled and alarmed his friends among the radicals of Geneva when he insisted that he didn't support their attempts to make the government of the city more democratic. Rousseau said that he himself preferred an aristocracy, that is, some kind of select assembly, but he was also willing to consider mixed forms of government, as indeed Hobbes had been. Describing a divided government along, in effect, Montesquieuian lines, Rousseau said that All the parts have then no less authority over the subjects, while their division makes them altogether less strong against the sovereign. So in some ways it's advantageous. Yeah. While Hobbes had said, though the sovereignty be not mixed, but be always either simple democracy or simple aristocracy or pure monarchy, nevertheless, in the administration thereof, all those sorts of government may have place subordinate. So a system like the United States, in which government, but not, as we shall see in a moment, sovereignty, has been divided in the Montesquieuian fashion, is perfectly in accordance with Rousseau's or Hobbes's ideas on sovereignty. There are not many people in the United States, I think, recognize that the US Constitution is a perfectly straightforward or Hobbesian constitution. For both Rousseau and Hobbes, the natural form which a democratic sovereign can take was, of course, an actual assembly, like that of an ancient city. Though an assembly, unlike many ancient assemblies, though not that of Rome, in that it would not possess governmental power. As far as Hobbes was concerned, though democracy is the original form of civil society, modern states characteristically are not democracies, nor should they be. The initial democracy can, he thought, legitimately dissolve itself and transfer its sovereignty to a small group or a single person. Rousseau, of course, denied this. And this simple point is the most important difference between him and Hobbes. But Rousseau, I think, had spotted a problem in Hobbes, which Hobbes himself never fully addressed. In all his works, Hobbes said that a sovereign cannot legitimately transfer its authority to another. So in chapter 30 of Leviathan, he said, "It is the office of the sovereign to maintain the essential rights of sovereignty entire, and consequently against his duty, first to transfer to another or to lay from himself any of them." But if you take that seriously, the initial democracy couldn't have legitimately dissolved itself. And if one wished, so to speak, to trace a lineage of legitimate sovereigns, the only legitimate modern state would have to be a democracy. So a clear-headed reading of Hobbes, which Hobbes himself shied away from at this point, rendered democracy not only primary, but because primary, the only legitimate form of civil society, just as Rousseau concluded. But that in turn meant that small assemblies, though they might be desirable, could not be expected to be the only form that a modern democracy would take, particularly as one point of the sovereign government distinction was to allow acts of sovereignty to be practical for the busy citizens of a modern state. Rousseau accordingly began his later works to consider institutional means in which large states could operate with democratic sovereigns. In his considerations of the government of Poland, he thought about mandated delegates to an assembly. In the project for Corsica, 1765, he seems to have considered the possibility of the sovereign people meeting separately in a number of large assemblies and then somehow coordinating their decisions. Curiously, though, Rousseau himself did not propose the obvious system, which was defended in explicitly Rousseauvian terms when it duly began to be used in a systematic fashion in France during the 1790s, the plebiscite or the referendum. Like the written constitution, with which it has so often been associated, the constitutional plebiscite is not at all a technically difficult idea. If you can organise a general election to a legislative assembly, as most European countries have been doing since the 13th century, you can organise a plebiscite. But it didn't occur to anyone to do such a thing until the late 18th century, after the ideas I have been discussing had become familiar, I think, precisely because the idea of a segregated and limited act of legislation, without the kind of discussion appropriate to an assembly, could not be conceived until something like the sovereignty government distinction had been drawn. And particularly with this audience, I would very much like, when we turn to questions after this, to talk about the Swiss case, which I've been looking into. I find it quite hard to make sense of it in some ways, but it seems to me that the so-called referendums before the Napoleonic period in some of the Swiss cantons, are not plebiscites or referendums in this sense. They are sending questions which have to be discussed in these communal assemblies, and indeed the final count is a majority of assemblies, not a majority of people, which is an important practical difference. So I say, though again we can discuss this later, I say the very first modern plebiscite in which the voting population of an entire state was asked to approve or disapprove of the proposed constitution, and heads were counted right across the state, took place in my other home. I mean, I live part of the year in Cambridge, England, the rest of the year I live in Cambridge, Mass, of course, teaching at Harvard, and the very first modern plebiscite took place in Massachusetts in 1778. I think that's clear. The General Court there decided in 1777 to draft a constitution for the newly independent state. This, of course, is before Federation. At the conclusions of its deliberation in May 1778, it then declared that it was submitting the constitution to the people and would require a two-thirds majority of the free men of Massachusetts for ratification. A statewide referendum was organized, which promptly rejected the constitution by a majority of 9,972 nays against 2,083 yeas, though it should be said that about a third of the towns didn't bother to submit the terms. The General Court then responded with an amended version which was passed. Part of the issue which was being disputed was the special role of Harvard University, oddly enough, or Harvard College as it then was, which is written into the Constitution of Massachusetts, because Harvard, as I'm sure you know, is in fact a state university, although it's often pretended that it's not. But it was founded by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Though it was hijacked by John Harvard somewhat later. As I said, this vote of 1778 was the first general referendum or plebiscite ever mounted in any state anywhere in the world, 15 years before the French Revolutionary use of the system. There was surprisingly little discussion of this in Massachusetts. Everyone seems to have agreed, more or less, with what, for example, the residents of Pittsfield, in the remote west of the state, said in their plea for a new constitution. A representative body may form, but it cannot impose a fundamental constitution upon a people. If this fundamental constitution is above the whole legislature, the legislature certainly cannot make it. It must be the approbation of the majority, which gives life and being to it. In other words, directly opposed to the English idea that a representative assembly, parliament, can pass fundamental constitutional laws. The residents of Pittsfield, in the real sort of far west of the state, absolutely denied that. New Hampshire followed closely on Massachusetts, holding a plebiscite on its constitution a few months later. And between 1778 and the beginning of the Civil War, almost all American states moved to a plebiscitary basis for their constitutions, with a particular rush occurring unsurprisingly in the heyday of Jacksonian democracy. At the start of 1861, only 5 states, out of a union of 34, did not use the plebiscite for constitutional amendment. It is, moreover, a fact of great interest and importance, though I find very few American historians know this, that of the 11 secessionist states in 1861, 7 were legally committed to plebiscites for any constitutional change. But of those 7, only Texas and Virginia actually put the secession to the vote. Virginia split as a result of this referendum into the present states of Virginia and West Virginia. And Texas, interestingly, having put an independence vote to the people, so it declared independence from the Union on the basis of a plebiscite, it did not put its subsequent accession to the Confederacy to a popular vote. So in all the plebiscitary southern states, there was what amounted to a coup d'etat by the supporters of the Confederacy, who didn't trust their electorates. These are white electorates. They didn't trust their electorates not to reject the breakup of the Union. In fact, in Alabama, there's a very interesting discussion in their constitutional convention, their convention, secessionist convention, where the supporters of the Confederacy say expressly, we do not trust our electors not to vote against secession. And the power, and one of them produced a gun. So this is the authority. So the secession may not have been illegal under the federal constitution. I think that remains an open question, actually. But it was certainly illegal under many of the secessionist states' own constitutions, and that's a dimension to the Civil War that we never think of. These American developments, and I'm talking here about state constitutions. I think I'm very interested in American state constitutions because They are, so to speak, the ideal type of American constitutional theory, since the federal constitution is, of course, the result of a lot of horse trading deals of various kinds. It's not a sort of pure document in many ways. Though it too does try and have a demarcation between sovereignty and government, in the sense that it, in a complicated way, in contentious ways, so I'm sure you know, at least opens the possibility that the Constitution, well, it certainly says the Constitution had to be ratified, and it opens the possibility of it being amended through dedicated but elected constitutional conventions. So it's a kind of halfway house. They don't move in a plebiscitary direction. Indeed, one of the delegates from Massachusetts to Philadelphia said, "Don't follow what my fellow citizens are doing, they're crazy." But they still wanted some sort of division. They did not want to replicate the British system with a sovereign assembly which also determines the constitutional rules. We can talk much more about that, perhaps in discussion. I don't want to go into detail at the moment, because there's more stuff I want to talk about in the French case. These American developments, both at the state and the federal level, may not have been spurred by the reading specifically of Rousseau, since, as we've seen, the distinction between sovereign and government, and the sovereign being the legislator, could be found in many places by the 1770s, including among the New England Congregationalists. But Rousseau was undeniably the clearest theorist of the distinction, and the Americans' actions were quickly justified in Rousseauvian categories. Rousseau was read and cited much more widely than people often realize in the American Revolution, since he's often quoted without acknowledgement. So you have to be quite cautious when you're looking for references to Rousseau. Rousseau was quoted during the debates on the Massachusetts Constitution, and English observers immediately linked him to the Americans. Josiah Tucker, for example, said already in 1778 that it was honest, undissembling Rousseau who was responsible for the Americans' idea that the people could not transfer their indefeasible right of voting for themselves to any others. And most strikingly of all, the first, and in some ways the most insightful American commentator on the Constitution, a man called St. George Tucker, who was a Virginian and wrote the first sort of full commentary on the Constitution at the beginning of the 19th century. He quoted Rousseau in his account of the general principles lying behind the American Constitution. And he went on to say, "The American Revolution seems to have given birth to this new political phenomenon. In every state, a written constitution was framed and adopted by the people, both in their individual and sovereign capacity and character. By this means, the just distinction between the sovereignty and the government was rendered familiar to every intelligent mind. The former was found to reside in the people and to be unalienable from them, the latter in their servants and agents. By this means also government was reduced to its elements, its object was defined, its principles ascertained, etc., etc. The same reasons operated in behalf of similar restrictions in the federal constitution, whether considered as the act of the body politic of the several states, or of the people of the states respectively, or of the people of the United States collectively." And he said, "The sovereignty, though always potentially existing in the people of every independent nation or state, is in most of them usurped by and confounded with the government," which of course is a wholly Rousseauian sentiment. I mean, Rousseau wrote a lot about usurpation, and in particular usurpation of sovereignty by government. The most extensive discussion of the distinction between sovereign and government and its practical implications for a modern state were, however, to be found in the France of the 1790s. I don't want to spend too long on this, since it's, after all, I'm sure, very familiar to all of you, and I want to return at the end to the American material and make some comments about its modern implications. But I would just like to say a little bit about the French side. The idea of a national plebiscite to vote on certain kinds of laws was first broached in the debates during September 1789 over the royal veto. At this stage, remember, the revolutionaries assumed that their new constitution would include the king. And the question was, should he possess a veto power, like notionally the King of England, or in practice, actually, as well as notionally, the President of the United States? A number of delegates to the Assembly, most of whom were later part of the Girondin group, proposed that the veto should act as a trigger for a national vote on the vetoed law. Quoting Rousseau, these delegates argued that such a vote would be a genuine expression of the general will and embody the distinction between the sovereign people and their government. This proposal failed. But when the Girondins moved closer to power after the execution of the king, the constitution which they put forward, partly under the leadership of Condorcet in February 1793, corresponded very closely to these ideas. It built in a plebiscite ratification and a system for constitutional amendment in which petitions could oblige the legislature to call a convention, and the results of the convention's deliberations were then put to a national popular vote. This proposal was never implemented. The Girondins lost the vicious political struggles of 1793, and most of them indeed lost their lives, so that there were few defenders of this kind of scheme left standing in France after the Terror. The Jacobins did put, as you know, I'm sure, did put a plebiscite into their constitution, which was promulgated in July and ratified in a referendum. But as the Girondins pointed out during the debates of the spring, the Jacobins were in effect pre-Rousseauian, since they wished for not just these fundamental measures to be decided by popular vote, but in effect all legislation. That is, they wished once again to elide the sovereign government distinction and to return to the unitary democracy of an ancient city, which, the Girondins prophetically observed, would mean in practice the rule of the Parisian proletariat. Nevertheless, the general principle of plebiscitary ratification of major constitutional laws held for much of the Revolution. Between 1793 and 1815, 7 national referendums were held, with each new constitution being ratified in this way. After the fall of Bonaparte, plebiscites were not used again until the rise of Napoleon III, and after 1870 they were not to be used again until the post-war referendums which established the Fourth and Fifth Republics. But in the 67 years since 1945, there have been 14 national plebiscites in France, and it's clear that the Girondin model is now permanently, well, I might get to call the Girondin model, is now permanently established there, as it is in most European countries, with the possible exception of Germany, though I think not actually, because the German situation is very complicated. We could talk about that. As I said, the states of the United States and Britain characteristically is being dragged kicking and screaming to this structure through the pretense that major constitutional acts now have to be passed on the basis of referendums which are purely consultative. But of course no one supposes the consultation will be disregarded. So in effect, though characteristically with a great deal of constitutional pretense, the United Kingdom has now changed to this model. But with the destruction of the Girondins, by the end of the Revolution, the only voices left were those of a few surviving Jacobins who continued to fantasize in Rousseauian terms about democratic government, and that of the great critic of this whole way of thinking about politics, the Abbé Sieyès. Though Sieyès introduced into constitutional theory, as again I'm sure you all know, the language of pouvoir constituant, pouvoir constitué, he meant by this terminology something very different from Rousseau or the Girondins, since he was profoundly and consistently opposed to anything but representation as a political principle. The pouvoir constituant could not be exercised, according to Sieyès, by the citizens themselves, but only by representatives. And though the representatives would meet in a dedicated convention, I mean that gave you the institutional structure of the pouvoir constituant, the results of their deliberation would not be presented for any kind of ratification, since, as Sieyès repeatedly made clear, a modern citizenry with universal suffrage could not itself deliberate, and therefore should not vote. Rebutting a proposal for mandated delegates in his Préliminaire de la Constitution of 1789, he asserted, with almost certainly Rousseau in mind, that it is not a question of some democratic head count, this is my translation, but of proposing, listening, consulting, changing one's opinion, in short, forming together a common will. It is not in the watches of the night, with everyone in their own houses, that the Democrats who are most jealous of their liberty form and affix their individual opinions to be carried from there into the public space. We would emphatically say that such a means of forming a common will would be absurd. When people gather, it is to deliberate, to know what other people are thinking, to benefit from mutual enlightenment, to compare particular wills, modify them, reconcile them, and eventually achieve a result which is common to a plurality. I now ask, should what would seem absurd in the most rigorous and jealous democracy be the rule for a representative legislature? Or should very striking and not very well known passage, actually, where Sieyès makes very clear that his theory is linked to the fact that deliberation is an essential feature of legislation. The irony of this story, which I summarise very briefly, is that although what one might term the Girondin practice ultimately won the day, the constitutional theorist who has most influenced modern writers is Sieyès. And the standard academic view of popular identity and power is that a modern state is essentially representative in character, just as was thought by Grotius and Pufendorf. I want to end just by making some American points, though, because I think they're of some interest and they have sort of general implications for both how to think now about the American Constitution, but also how to think about similar constitutions around the world. What is clear, to start with, is that the Americans believed that in place of one sovereign legislature, the British Parliament, they were putting another, the collected people of either an American state or, in some sense, the entire Union. This was not metaphorical or imaginary. The people, in the ideal type of the state constitutions, was the sovereign legislator through the process of majority voting, like any democratic legislature. And even, as I said, though the federal constitution contains many compromises, it sought as far as possible to reproduce this system through conventions charged exclusively with the task of ratification and separate from a drafting convention. It should be said, incidentally, on those conventions that some of them did it actually then, they were free to put the ratification to a referendum in their state. Rhode Island did, which is one reason why Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution for many years. Massachusetts debated about putting, the Massachusetts Convention, State Convention, debated about putting ratification to a plebiscite and deciding not to. The point of the system was, of course, the conviction which the Americans shared with Rousseau and the Girondins, that if it is possible to have genuine democracy in the modern world through systems of this sort, then it will permit people to be in some sense self-legislating and not owe obedience to any fundamental laws in the making of which they did not themselves participate. I say this, which might seem to be obvious, because the curious thing about much modern American jurisprudence is that it has forgotten it. Aki Lamar at Yale is an honourable exception to this. You could take as an example, I don't know if any of you know the modern American jurist Keith Whittington, who's done a lot of work in this area, and indeed has used the distinction between sovereign and government to clarify the relationship between the Constitution and the institution it prescribes. But at a crucial moment in his argument, Whittington swerves, as it would have seemed to the early Americans, and takes the task of constitutional interpretation to be faithfulness to the original intent of the authors of the Constitution. He has stressed, correctly I think, that the Constitution is legislation, and has then concluded that its meaning for us is to be found by reconstructing its meaning for the original legislators. But that's not what the 18th century radicals who put this system in place thought. It's not what any reasonable person would think, since in their eyes it would have made nonsense of the whole point of democracy. Tucker again put it very clearly. Government, said the Congress of the American States in behalf of their constituents, derives its just authority from the consent of the governed. This fundamental principle then may serve as a guide to direct our judgment with respect to the question. To which we may add, in the words of the author of Common Sense, Thomas Paine, a law is not binding upon posterity merely because it was made by their ancestors, but because posterity had not repealed it. It is the acquiescence of posterity under the law which continues its obligation upon them, and not any right which their ancestors had to bind them. In this he echoed Rousseau. Yesterday's law is not binding today, but silence is taken for tacit consent, and the sovereign is held to confirm incessantly the laws it does not abrogate as it might. And it is, of course, also Hobbes's view. This is a familiar theory in the 17th and 18th century. And although, as a general theory of law, it may be untenable, as Hart argued very strenuously in his famous The Concept of Law, it is a natural and persuasive adjunct to a theory of democratic legislation, or legitimacy, the essence of which, as I said, is self-legislation. That's the point of it. The authority of a constitution for us on this theory can't be that it is the legislation of a group of people in a wildly undemocratic society in the remote past, but can only be that it could be changed but has not been by us. And I think this is true of many assemblies. For example, it would be crazy to say that the authority of the Act of Settlement, which is very important in the United Kingdom because it determines who gives the Queen, it makes the Queen. Without the Act of Settlement, she wouldn't be Queen. That it rests on the authority of a group of crazy or half-crazy Protestants in a only sort of partially representative assembly. I mean, that cannot be a reasonable view of what makes the Act of Settlement still legitimate for us. What makes it legitimate, seems to me, a much more reasonable view is the old view, that it could be repealed but has not been. So it's, in a sense, it's an act of the present Parliament. And I would say the same of the American people. And that means that the American Constitution has to be understood as our will and not the will of the founders. The American people may be a sleeping sovereign, may even in some sense be in jail, I think, actually. But it's not dead, not quite. And as long as it's alive, it's its presumed will, the presumed will of the living people, which should govern the interpretation of the Constitution, and not the presumed will of people, all of whom have now been dead for more than 200 years.